The classroom clock is exactly at 10:30, so I think we'll get started. I want to welcome you all to our seminar in STEM education, the spring seminar offered by the CSTL. And I want to welcome everybody who has given of their time this morning to participate in this seminar. So welcome. Special welcome to Mary Kay Walton from FUSD here. Mary Kay is the Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum in our school district. Yeah. So I want to introduce our seminar speaker for this morning, Dr. Heidi Carlone. Comes to us from University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where she is the Hooks Distinguished Professor of STEM Education. I'm not going to talk about her work because she is here to talk about her work. However, I will mention that her work has earned her several $1 million in external grants. It has earned her several awards at the institutional and national levels. And so I'm extremely pleased that we have this morning with us Dr. Heidi Carlone. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carlone.
Thank you guys for having me. What I did was use the getting together, the preparation of this talk, to kind of take stock a little bit about what I've learned from my identity research over the past few years. So I'm going to start off with a critical retrospective. And I kind of write it as like a Dear Identity Lens perspective. What have you done for me? And the reason I'm framing it this way is because when I started this work 23 years ago, since I've started that work, identity research has blown up, well, as much as anything blows up, in educational research literature. So I want to say, okay, what have I learned about a good education from studying identity? What have I learned about good teaching? What have I learned about kids' potentials? What have I learned about equity from using this identity lens? So I'm going to kind of go back and kind of take stock. Before I do that, though, I would really like to give you some perspective on my framework and how I'm thinking about identity and how I've used it over the years. So my identity lens is partnered with a cultural lens. So it demands some lens toggling. So a lot of times when you think about identity, you immediately go to an individual. My work actually starts with culture and the culture of a learning setting, which looks at shared meanings that are produced in practice of what a good student is, what a smart student is, what a struggling student is, what good science is, what good engineering is, you name it. When we engage in practice, we come up with shared meanings about what's happening in the setting. And so when people look at identity, I think they jump right to the individual, where I'm jumping to the norms of the setting. Then, from the norms of the setting, I can better understand individuals' participation in that setting if I know what kind of they're up against. So I go from the cultural lens to the individual lens, and then pop up to the macro social structure lens, which focuses on race, class, gender, sexuality, these larger enduring structures. So this is a lens toggling that I talk about. So this might look like, sorry about that, I did the wrong thing. This might look like I'll go into a classroom, I will spend a fair amount of time in the classroom, and I'll determine what the norms and practices are in that setting. And then I might pop up to the macro level and describe kind of how that lens is positioned in a larger historical way. Like, what does it mean to be a good student in this setting? And how does that compare to how historically good students have been positioned and have been constructed? And then I'll zoom back down to understand how that construction of good student in the setting affects students who have been historically marginalized and oppressed in and by science. And so that's kind of an example of this lens toggling that I'm talking about. So I'm going to give you a second to read through this slide. All right, so when I'm looking at this kind of dual identity and culture lens, what does it help us understand and helps us recognize? First is power. Second is cultural reproduction. Third is moments of agency. And fourth is moments of improvisation. And so really what I'm talking about here is the tension between structure and agency. Structure is kind of like the norms in the setting that kind of shape what's allowable and what's disallowable, what's celebrated and what's marginalized, what performances are valued and which ones are not valued. That's the structure, okay? The agency is, okay, individuals can creatively work within and against and around those kind of structures to perform themselves as either expected identities or unexpected identities. So my work, I'll be honest, for about the first 15 years of my work, I think I really, really only saw cultural reproduction. It was hard, y'all. And y'all, don't judge. It was hard though, because you kept seeing the same thing again and again and again and again, even though I was looking for really cultural production, which would imply different meanings. I think identity researchers, if I can be a little provocative, sometimes overemphasize moments of agency and celebrate these little shiny moments without thinking about how those fit into a longer term meanings. I think we love individuals. And I think when we frame problems as individual problems, individuals' knowledge, teachers' preparation, students' motivation, I think what we're doing is we're missing some of those larger structural issues. So when you think about identity work as something that's just about the individual, you're missing the structural components of that identity work that shape who students can be. And it also assumes that with the individual that you can alter yourself however you want to, when that's actually not the case. And it's especially not the case for students who have been historically marginalized. So we're moving away from this push on individuals. So what do I do? How do I move away from this individual thing when I'm talking about identity? Rather than ask, so you walk into a science learning setting or a math learning setting or an engineering learning setting, and you ask, what are students learning? What do individual students know? That's fine, but I don't ask that question. That's not the first thing I ask. I ask it, but I don't ask it first. I ask, who are students obligated to be in this setting? So what I'm doing is I'm using a situated definition of competence by asking, what do students have to know, do, be, act, dress, whatever, to be considered competent in this setting? And so some of the things I might look for in a setting are, what are the norms of participation in this setting? What counts as a good question in this setting? What types of questions are the students asking? What type of questions is the teacher asking? What are the spaces that you have to hold the floor for their scientific ideas? Those are just some examples of concrete behaviors I might look at to understand over time what are the norms and what are the implicit meanings of science. So in this view, competence isn't an individual trait. It is, you can find competence in the interaction between students' opportunities to participate competently and the meanings they're making of those opportunities. Because they might be like, I know what I'm supposed to do. I know you feel like you're setting me up for success, but I don't want anything to do with that. That's not who I am or who I want to be. Or they could be like, yeah, this is great. This is exactly who I want to be. Let me give you a concrete example. So if you guys, if you've been teachers, you know who this student is. You have a know-it-all student in one of your classes who knows all the answers, is like the encyclopedia. And in one setting, this student is just lauded for it's usually a he, his understanding and his great use of vocabulary and his kind of smartness. All the peers think he's brilliant, teachers think he's brilliant. But in another setting, that same student could be considered as rigid, not willing to take risks, too dependent on authoritative knowledge. So it depends on the norms of the setting as to what gets counted as competent. Give you a second to read that slide if you need it. Okay, so the left-hand side of the slide is about me treating identity as a verb. Hint to any future researchers or new budding researchers out there who want to do identity, I always tell my graduate students, try not to use the term, I'm going to measure students' identity, unless you're using Zara Hazari's work, and then go for it. She's amazing and brilliant. But try not to use, I want to study the development of students' identity or the formation or what their identities are at the end of the program. You are opening yourself up to so much critique by doing that. So instead, you talk about verbing identity, ascribing identity to others, performing identity, authoring identity, doing identity work. I think what it does is it recognizes that A, identity work is not an individual construct, and B, identity work happens within a matrix of oppression. So the identity work that, say, an African American girl who comes from poverty has to do to fit into a white, predominantly white middle class school is significantly more than an affluent white boy would have to do in the same setting. And so it's work. It's never a final form achievement. So that same African American girl in one class may have figured it out, and she goes to the next class and has to kind of rework her identity work significantly in order to be viewed as competent. So when people author identities, what they're doing is they're performing combinations of speech and behavior and dress and gestures, all for like what they think is appropriate in that particular setting, right? But the thing is that they can perform all they want, but it's dependent on the others in the group to legitimate those performances as authentic or as one of us or fitting in. And so, as we say, identity is never this kind of individual performance. It's always dependent on others' recognition of that performance being legitimate, being competent, etc. My favorite question ever. How compelling, imaginable, and achievable are the meanings of promising science person for different youth in a setting? This is way different than the question, what do students know and what can they do at the end of an intervention? Which is normally what we're asking, right? The problem is, guys, I've seen too many people and too many kids who can do it, who know it, and they're still not affiliated, okay? So they know what they need to do. And that particular identity is either unavailable to them or unreasonable for them or not believable for them, or it's something they don't want to affiliate with. And so the broader you can make that space of this kind of imaginary student, this celebrated subject position, the more inclusive your setting is. And I'll give you an example of that. By the way, the t-shirt, one of my graduate students gave that to me because she's like, you always say this. And I'm like, yes, exactly, I do. So let's go back to the question, dear identity, what have you done for me? I want to get back, so I'm giving you a little bit of background about the way I frame identity. Are there any questions about the framing of identity before I go to my myth-busting piece of the puzzle? It's okay if they're not, I'll give good wait time. Sounds like I can move on. You'll have plenty of things to say later, I hope. And so, what I'm going to do is I took 3 myths about what I thought, what I feel like the common good thinks about what equitable science might look like, and I want to bust those myths with the identity lens. All right, myth number 1. Strong science learning plus positive attitudinal outcomes equals equitable science. So you have 2 settings that produce, or 3 or 4 or 100, that produce very strong learning outcomes among the students, achievement outcomes, and very strong, all students in the class, they like science. They give it a 4 out of 5 or, 4 plus. So you're like, okay, good. You've got an equitable situation. And so, and to an extent that may be true, but I'm saying that we're missing some things if that's our the highest thing we can go for. If that's our benchmark, and if that's our kind of standard, then we're missing a bunch. This is old work, but it keeps coming back, so I'm going to use it. I'm going for it. The easiest way to explain this myth and bust this myth is to show you an animation by a doctoral student at Michigan State University who put this together, Christy Thomas Morrison. And as you watch the video, I want you to think about, can you identify, so you've got homework for the video. What are the characteristics of the ideal student, what I call the celebrated subject position in each of these classrooms? Like what do students have to know, be able to do in order to be considered competent in the setting? 1. 2, what norms and practices might have provided more youth to identify with the meaning of smart science student in Ms. Wolf's classroom? So what were the norms and practices she put in place? Got it? And then 3, how does this case relate to identity? Got it? So you've got ideal subject position, what does it look like? What are the characteristics? The norms and practices that might have made a difference, and then what the heck does this have to do with identity? All right, I'm hoping this is going to work.
In a science classroom, have you ever wondered who gets to identify as a smart science student? It turns out this is important, and classroom teachers make a big difference. Not that long ago, researchers explored this question by spending a year in 2 similar classrooms. The classrooms were in the same school district, at the same grade level, with teachers committed to high-quality science instruction who were both well known as outstanding educators. Students in both classrooms had positive attitudes about science, did well on science assessments, were engaged in their daily science activities, and were diverse racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically. But then, the researchers asked, who are the smart science students in your class? And found things were no longer the same. In Mrs. Sparrow's classroom, smart science students were described as knowing facts, answering the teacher's questions correctly, and doing science at home. In Mrs. Sparrow's class, only 4 of the 15 students identified themselves as a smart science student. And strikingly, 5 students stated immediately, without hesitation, that they did not share any characteristics of the students they identified as the smart science students. These 5 were all females of color. In Ms. Wolf's classroom, the smart science students were described differently. There, smart science students asked good questions, were good observers, were good group members, and kept trying even when they were wrong. In Ms. Wolf's class, all 18 students identified themselves as a smart science student or indicated they shared those characteristics. So, what's going on? There's no one single smart science student identity. It's a socially constructed identity within the context of the science classroom culture. And developing this identity is not an individual endeavor. Further, this is an issue of equity. Is the smart science student identity compelling and accessible to every student? It turns out there's a lot that teachers can do to support the construction of a science classroom culture in which a smart science student identity is both compelling and accessible. Let's look at Ms. Wolf's successes. She established classroom norms including we share scientific ideas and we solve problems together. She modeled and explicitly discussed what sharing ideas and solving problems together would look and sound like. She held students accountable for these expectations, asking students to explain their groupmates' ideas and consistently redirecting them toward their partners. In whole class conversations, Ms. Wolf helped students share observations, build on others' ideas, and develop new questions and investigations together. Contrastingly, Mrs. Sparrow's classroom norm of turn-taking fostered small group work in which the more dominant and assertive students got more time with materials and received more recognition for their science ideas during the whole class time. Shifts toward three-dimensional science classrooms in which students are
A little bit off the topic here because it's not necessarily. So what I want you to do is turn and talk with a partner right now about the three things that we wanted you to talk about, which were so these three questions. So turn and talk real quick. I won't give you too much time. All right, let's share out. What are some of the insights that you guys had about Sparrow and Wolf? Tell me about what are some of the characteristics. We'll just do shout out. What are some of the characteristics of the ideal science person in Sparrow's classroom?
Individual knowledge and contributions.
Correct answer.
What else? Science with editors. Good. What else?
Taking turns.
What?
Taking turns when asking.
Yeah, taking turns, yeah. Which,
Compliance.
yeah, compliance. Which taking turns actually surprised me, as it seems like a pretty innocuous practice. You know, like, let's share and take turns, everybody. It turns out that it was actually had some sort of detrimental effects on equity. What about Wolf's class? What are some of the ideal science student characteristics?
Collaboration.
Yeah, collaboration.
Trying.
Process of a product.
Curiosity, process of a product.
Persistence and failure.
We create science instead of reproducing.
Yeah.
Ideas come from students as well as the body of science knowledge.
And Norm was explaining what your partner or what others were thinking, not just what I as an individual can think.
It's so much more accessible than having the right answer said the right way. The space is so much broader for so many more students. Y'all, here, when I get passionate, my y'all comes out. So, I just hate when, if skeptics hear this, they might hear, oh, well, this is a fluffy, like, skipping through daisies, everyone answers is right, everyone gets a gold medal. No. This was highly rigorous, explain your thinking, use the data, understand the data, why do you think what you think? The standards for thinking scientifically, I'm telling you, were incredibly higher. Now, this is not to disparage Sparrow, because her class, you'd walk in and you'd be like, this is a great class. But you gotta dig a little deeper. Okay?
What was the grade level?
Grade level in, this one was 4th. Yep. There is a little bit of a change with Sparrows that made a difference too. I'm scared to tell you this because I don't want it to discredit my work. But you're gonna be like, well, of course that's why she did all the stuff she did. It did make a difference. It did make a difference. It was a dual language classroom. So half of the instruction was in Spanish and half the instruction was in English. And you had half of our class as native Spanish speakers and half of our class as native English speakers. So that power differential was really minimized quite significantly more than it would have been otherwise.
I would just question if, what would the answers be at the beginning of class compared to at the end of class? And did Ms. Wolf's her, wow, I didn't know I was good in science kind of attitude. And now I think I'm a good science student because we have norms within families and so forth. It's like, well, you know, I never was good in science, so you probably won't be either.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. There was a number of students have that narrative. I didn't used to think I was this way, but now I am this way. And then following them through fifth and sixth was actually interesting too. So they had this one great fourth grade class, and so I followed them through seventh grade. So fifth, sixth, seventh grade. I followed really 13 intensively, but 26 were in the study total. And we'll actually get a little taste of that in a minute. I'm going to move on. I'm sure you had great discussions about the rest of this. So let's talk about myth number 2. Myth number 2 is that the students who are most interested and knowledgeable about science have an easier time pursuing a science trajectory. And usually these students are boys. And this assumes that knowledge plus interest equals success, and especially talking about when you're thinking about this in terms of gender and boys. This ignores a whole host of other kinds of social and cultural factors that go into producing smooth trajectories and bumpy trajectories for kids. So we riffed on Nancy Brookhouse's famous article, What Kind of Girl Does Science?, to ask what kind of boy does science. And we decided to look at 4 boys who, in our minds in 4th grade, were set up for success. Super knowledgeable, super engaged, super persistent, recognized by peers as, as being smart in science, and we followed them through their 6th grade science classes. This study is really to disrupt the oversimplified brand narrative of science is for boys. So we had 4 boys in the study, and despite their initial positioning, all 4 of them, as smart in 4th grade, Evan and Colin had an easier time sustaining these identities through 6th grade science. You may be wondering about ethnicity, race, etc. Evan and Colin are upper middle class white boys. Forrest is a comes from a working class family, he's white. And Camila is Latino, and he comes from a professional middle class kind of, his mom is a teacher and his dad was an engineer. So today I'm going to focus in on Colin's and Camila's trajectories. Let's look at Colin first. So Colin is your typical kind of smart kid, and what I say by that is he gets recognized as being academically smart. He was positioned as AIG, which in North Carolina is academically and intellectually gifted. He made his bids to be recognized when uncontested from others. And also he kind of, he didn't really consider himself all that scientific. He's like, whatever, if people recognize me, that's fine. If they don't, whatever. In other words, his bids to get recognized by others as being scientific were super low stakes for him. Not high stakes at all. And he was good at it. When called to do so, he would perform himself scientifically. He could never remember one favorite activity in science. Every year we interviewed him, and he was like, I don't know. It was all fine, just very lukewarm about the whole thing. In 6th grade, it was actually remarkable to see how even his trajectory was. He didn't like science too much, still couldn't remember a great activity. He never considered himself one of the smartest science students. And he consistently, this is important, performed himself with this calm, confident, but not overconfident, very likable kind of confident manner. And so the masculinity literature calls this calm rationality and muscular intellect. So in comparison, let's look at Camila. Camila saw himself as uniquely smarter than the average 4th grader, in science especially, and he performed himself extremely confidently in science. He had numerous out-of-school science experiences, including an after-school program at a planetarium. We just talked about astronomy in my prior meeting. But he struggled to work well with peers. He would really want to do things his way, and he would sometimes cry if he didn't get his way, and tell the teacher that the kids were being mean to him, and the teacher did a lot of work with him to try to get him to understand how his actions may have been contributing to some of the problems. So I want to show you a brief glimpse of Camila's performance in small group, in a whole group setting. And I want you to look at, if you could describe his identity performances, how would you characterize Camila's identity performances? And this is the part of the video that we need to switch over. So don't show this. I just don't want the kids, this to be blasted over.
Yeah, well, I think mine stayed down because there's two different types when I got it, either younger or older. I wish I could get younger to see its growth process. And why do frogs have talons? Well, I'm not exactly sure. I've asked the salesman, what's that specific word I just heard? I'm sorry. What is that? And then right under this, write 15. Okay, now in the right column, on the top right, 14 and less.
Okay, so turn and talk real quick. What are some identity performances you saw with Camila? Got about 1 minute. All right, what were some, let's do a little popcorn shout out. Like what are some things you noticed about his identity performances?
Leadership.
Good.
The role of leader.
Mm-hmm.
Science authority.
Confident?
Science authority.
Authoritative, yeah.
Sounds like an expert.
Okay. We called him Little Professor. You know, he had the best on. What else?
He was inquisitive.
All right, so in 5th grade, he kind of continued with these kinds of performances, albeit they didn't do as much science, so he didn't have as many opportunities to perform himself this way. His 5th grade teacher did say she thought he derived a lot of his self-esteem from his performances in science. So for him, his science performances were super high stakes. And he would frequently make bids to the adults in the room. That mattered to him, that recognition by adults. So we popped to 6th grade, and in 6th grade, science was much more about school than it was about science. Virtually no small group work and talking substantively about scientific ideas, no modeling on, no phenomenon-based instruction, a lot of book work and vocabulary, and but then there was this other kind of norm of social behavior that really Camilo had no access to. And that was a constant jokey atmosphere in the room at 6th grade, middle school. And a lot of valued performances were about being cool and being athletic and being calm and like, nothing's bothering me, where that was not at all who Camilo was. His social identities, performances through 4th and 5th were not that way at all. And so he didn't typically participate in these low-level schooly tasks. Now the good news is, because he kept up with his out-of-school science experiences, he maintained a really strong science identity work. He still thought of himself as highly scientific, but he knew that what they were doing in school wasn't really science. So whatever, he was leaving it at the door. And the sad thing is, he really was pretty disengaged from 6th grade science. In these Colin and Camilo examples, we're not just looking about the problematic aspects of the norms in the classroom. Absolutely, the norms in the classroom played a role. But also, if you pop up to the macro level timescale of heteronormative masculinity, that was really very, very relevant in shutting Camilo out and preventing his access. It's not just that the norms of the setting were inequitable, but the larger time scale of historical ways of being a smart boy in school was also relevant. Myth number 3. Youth must view science as relevant before they engage meaningfully. So we had a little preview of this in our conversation previously to this. So here's the thing. Right now there's a big push, and it needs to be a big push, of culturally relevant science. And the idea is that we want to leverage students' interests and their knowledge and connect it to something scientific. So we're leveraging it, and we're seeing these as assets and values in their meaning making and sense making. This is necessary. However, I also wonder if there's value in the unthinkable science. And the science they never thought they would be interested in, but it turns out when given an opportunity to do stuff, to do unthinkable science, they engage and they surprise themselves. So this is what happened in our HERP project. Y'all, it's not the herpes project. HERP project, herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians. And so if you want to choose something that's really going to push you outside of their comfort zone, reptiles and amphibians might be one of those things, and it turns out it was. So my job was to study in this youth identity work in the setting and then beyond over time. So if you can take a look at the slides first before I start talking, just take a look at the quotes. I'm a qualitative researcher, and there's nothing that bothers me more than cherry picking data. This is not a cherry pick. I could have given you almost any kid's interview. Más o menos, like 10 kids, and it would have had something like this. This was a trend across all of the data. What we call it informally, I hope I can say this. If I can't, then oh well. We called it the from hell no to maybe so. And so this was this identity boundary work that the kids were engaged in, where they didn't think they were going to be these kinds of people that would handle snakes and be outside and singing in the woods and catching lizards. And it turns out, when given the opportunity to do so, they engaged with open minds, persistence, resilience, and joy and wonder. And it was, I was really hesitant. I'm like, I'm not sure about this. I'm a hiker, I'm a camper, and I'm not really a frog person. I'd give me a snake any day of the week. It's just frogs. I don't know. It's jumping, I think. And so I was skeptical, and youth just embraced it. And so I think, yes, it was in their own backyards. We did it at a camp, but it was, they were beginning to see their places differently after engaging in this kind of science. So it was relevant in that sense, but initially they really were this. I'm here just because my mom made me come and I don't want to be here, but I'll do it, whatever. And then the transformations over time were really, really quite interesting. So my point is that unthinkable science can also be productive. For example, fear in small doses and handled with empathy and care became a resource for youth's identity boundary work and connections to animals, nature, and science. And being scientific meant being brave, trying new things, and doing things you never thought you would do. But when do we give students the opportunity to have that kind of school science experience? This study made me think differently about culturally relevant science. So I'm going to return. Dear identity, what have you done for me? What have you taught me? Well, it turns out that the identity lens and the cultural lens have taught me quite a few things, and these are just a few that we mentioned today. But in addition, and this is probably a slide I won't have to be able to go through in depth, so you can take a picture of it if you want to remember it for later. In addition, what I've done is kind of compile the pedagogical practices that I don't see well represented in the literature. About what is it that, what's teaching practices, what classroom practices, how can learning be organized for youth that do kind of allow youth to engage in robust science identity work. So a lot of the stuff that we saw is represented here, but I won't go through all of it so that we can have time for questions. And so I can have time to give you a glimpse about what we're doing next, because I think it might surprise you. Do you have a question?
Would you be comfortable sharing that slide?
Oh yeah, I can share the whole entire slideshow minus the video.
Okay.
Yeah, that's no problem. Okay. So, a peek at the next horizon. I love this idea. I've been salivating over people's work that don't just study the identity kind of from here. They actually design for students' identity work. This is the new wave of educational research in general, is design work. It's been around for a long time, but I think people are getting on board. Did anybody in here, does anyone do design-based work, design-based research? It's hard. Oh my God. Because you're actually designing the intervention and then studying it and then revising it and then studying it and then yeah, that's what we're doing right now. I'm going to give you one example. Okay, I actually have about 2 or 3 design projects going on right now. One is our Bridges project, which is an iTest and a ZepGrant. And what we've done is we started with a framework. I took all the design principles that I've learned from my identity studies. And I have another slide about identity work, design principles. But this is our framework, okay? We start with and my environmental ed people don't like me calling it socio-environmental problem. They're like, environmental problems are all social, you don't have to reproduce the socio. But I'm doing it for non-environmental environmental people to highlight that environmental problems are social and ecological. So we start with a socio-environmental problem, and we think about it in terms of doing good. We have this altruistic component that we know that students from marginalized groups like to think about science as a tool for altruistic and or conservationist kind of ways of thinking about it. So doing good for the environment, doing good for human health. Then we have investigating and problem solving with science and engineering. We have struggled with the computing, and if any of you guys have ideas for that. For now, we've put it as kind of this bridge between the doing good and the investigating problem solving. If you see, we have these labels right here. I'm so nervous about presenting this part because it's going to be a little bit different than how I normally talk about identity. Okay, so the labels are there. Ready? You see the labels. You don't need to know what they are yet. These are the labels. Okay. So we took our framework and said, okay, what are some identity profiles that might, for kids, I wanted to design programs or programming that appeal to multiple kinds of kids. The athletes, the puzzle solvers, the people lovers, the arty kids, all sorts of kids. So we narrowed down to 6 kind of identity profiles. Conservationist, designer, tinker, altruist, analyst, and strategist. Got it? All right. So here I am, right, telling you that identity emerges in practice, and we don't like predefine people with certain identities, and here I am, predefining. But wait, I hope you're like at least a little intrigued about what I'm doing for this. Okay, so they take an instrument, which is still being designed. Let me tell you, y'all, this is not a research instrument yet, okay? So yeah, it's not validated. It's not going to mark them and score them for life in any way, sense, or form. But what it does is it allows them on day 1, before we've done any kind of intervention, it allows them to see the ways who they are and what they're interested in are already STEM-like. are already connected to some aspect of STEM. So each kid gets a profile, and we have a little explanation of the profile underneath it that says, okay, you are, 27% altruist and 20% conservationist. That means you might like doing these kinds of things. Now, it turns out that you're a little bit low on the analyst. It may be because you've never had the opportunity to do analyst kinds of activities, or you may not have a good feel for what that is yet. What we do is we position this not as a stamp on kids to say, oh, I'm not an analyst, I'm not doing that. We position it as kind of like, this is an area where you can think about growing over time, and or these are strengths that you bring to your group that others might not have. So it's an interesting how it plays out. We designed the curriculum. Every single activity has 3 or more profiles we think would appeal to that activity, right? All right, so you with me so far? Are there questions? No, not yet. Right. So it turns out, so far, it's a little initial data here, that these STEM profiles actually broaden the celebrated subject position. And this is evidenced by end of program interviews, where we ask you, what kind of kid would like to do the Bridges program? And they just like, every kind of kid. They're like, this is for the designers, this is for the engineers, this is for the science kids, this is for the arty kids. I'm an arty kid. I never thought I would like something like this. But in this context, my art mattered. My art helped the group. And so they begin to think of themselves as, not of themselves, of the kind of ideal, that celebrated subject position, as much broader than geeky white science kid who has all the right answers from the encyclopedia or Google. I guess it's Google now. So anyway, so it broadened the celebrated subject position. And also, it gave them, I think this is pretty intriguing, it gave them language to actually raise to the fore their own identity work related to STEM. So I never thought I'd be able to do the analyst or the strategist stuff, but since I've been at Bridges, I'm starting to have my hopes up that I can do this. When I'm back at school, I study more problems, and it's fun to come up with solutions, just like we've been doing here. We have a lot of the, again, these aren't cherry picked. This is pretty much what the interviews look like. I never thought I was, or I never thought my designer thing was relevant, but it turns out it is. Again, I think this is going to be pretty controversial to the field. I probably should give people the critiques of my own work, but this is me on my shoulder. I can critique my work better than anyone else here. That's kind of, I think that it could run the risk of stamping kids. And we have to do our pedagogy in ways that don't stamp kids. So if you want to take a picture of this, you can actually take the identity profile instrument yourself. Y'all, we are completely revising it. First of all, we're Likkertizing it. So right now it's a forced choice priority thing, 3. We're going to turn it into a Likert scale thing. I'm working with a statistician to get it a little bit more robust. So it's going to be changed, but it's so fun to take it. You're like, oh, cool. Anyway. All right, questions. We have like a whole 6 minutes for questions. Okay.
So much of, well, pretty much most of your work is focused on kids, school children. Many of us in this room work with pre-service teachers,
right,
undergraduate, adult population. I'm wondering to what extent and in what ways might identity development as a science teacher be different from the identity development as students, and what thoughts might you have about pre-service teacher preparation that can lead to a more positive identity development as a science teacher?
Wow, that's a big question. So I'm doing work with teachers too, and that's another piece of my designing for identity work. We have a network of 150 elementary teachers we're working with. And I think some of it is the same. And what is the same in terms of my conceptual framework is teachers have to do identity work to take up a science teacher identity. And for elementary schools, I am positive this will resonate with anybody across this country, is that the contortions one has to put oneself through to fit robust science and engineering into the curriculum is pretty significant. So you're thinking about constraints of time, curriculum, priorities, end of grade tests, what I'm held accountable to from my principal. Those are constraints and those are structures that the teacher has to work within and against to get science into their curriculum. So we talk a lot about stuff that isn't even scientific when I'm working with teachers. We talk about the science too, but we also talk about cultivating a tempered radical identity, which is an identity where you're not compliant. Sorry for the administrator in the room, I hope this is okay. We are not producing radicals with a temper, it's tempered radicals. And so, so these are teachers who are willing to push up against the structures that exist to fit really robust, rigorous, and responsive science and engineering instruction into their classes. So that's just one tiny example of this work that the teachers need to do to actually get science and engineering happening. The first question I asked my pre-service teachers in my class, I said, how many of you love to do what you're told? How many of you love to get A's? How many of you love to do what your boss says to do? This is elementary teachers. They all their hands go up. I'm like, we're going to have to change a little bit of that. We're going to get science and engineering into the curriculum. So that's one small example.
For the secondary teacher who doesn't have that same issue, who's coming in to be a biology teacher and will teach biology or chemistry, when we are working with them in the pre-service setting, what are some things that should or shouldn't be done to develop the identity of a good biology teacher, a good chemistry teacher?
Well, I think deconstructing what counts as science, deconstructing what counts as a good science student. What are you holding, I mean, my question is about what are you holding students accountable to be? What counts as a competent science person in this classroom? In what ways is that accessible, believable, and achievable to all students in the classroom? So if you get them having those conversations, because the big hullabaloo with secondary teachers is that their conceptions of science tend to be pretty narrow. And so the idea is to disrupt those narrow versions of narrow meanings of what counts as science and what counts as science person to allow them to think differently about their own discipline that they've been very successful at. I mean, physics teachers, they're the boundary guarders, you know, and so are chemistry teachers, so are biology teachers. I mean, all teachers in some ways are, and for very good reasons. This is not a teacher bashing thing. This is, you know, teachers have very good reasons as to why they teach the way they do. But I'm trying to keep my time.
Anybody else? Any final questions?
I have a question. Yes, I can't resist. So, we have a large Native American population of students in the Flagstaff area, and I love the first project, specifically the Colin to make it so. I'm curious if you have any suggestions. Our Native American populations often have taboos towards interacting with certain organisms, so I'm wondering how, because I've always struggled with this, with like changing their identity, but also like respecting their cultural beliefs. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions or insight.
I think you're going to be the smarter one about this local context. So in our context, we had Lumbee students as a part of our HERT project, and they had no such prescriptions against any of the organisms or the ways that we were treating the organisms. So there were no kind of taboos. We found the taboos were much more with our some of our rural populations, which were first generation, who had never been outside or whose parents hadn't been outside. So the parents were saying, do not touch the toads because you're going to get warts. So it was an easier thing to push a little bit on because we could inform them knowledge. Ironically, more knowledge about what things actually happened was how we kind of disrupted some of those. But I would not begin, especially in 1 minute, to presume what to do with the Native American populations here. You all are much more experts about what to do here. I think that would be a great lunch conversation. I want to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Heidi.
Thank you.